10 days to go till Freedom Day. At least it's the 9th of July today, so that makes sense to me. Okay. Oh, Mr. Whitefield. He, that's Wesley, was not alone. In the 1730s and 1740s, there was heartwarming going on both sides of the Atlantic. In Britain, it was the Evangelical Revival. It was the Great Awakening in British America. I like that phrase, British America. Happy days. Different names, but the same experience. Revival, people experiencing Christ in an entirely new way. And one of the great preachers of this mass heartburn was a friend of Wesley's called George Whitefield, 1714 to 70. Whitefield had been banned from preaching in the same churches, in the state churches, because of his radical idea that a lot of people in Anglican churches might not actually be Christians. He responded to this prohibition by preaching outdoors, in fields, market squares, anywhere where he could gather a crowd. And he was a fabulous preacher. It was not that he was in any way glamorous. On the contrary, he was severely cross-eyed. But he could command the attention of the crowd in a way few others could. David Garrick, the greatest actor of his age, once said that he would give 100 guineas if I could say, "Oh," like Mr. Whitefield. His first sermon was said to have driven 13 people mad. I've preached sermons like that, although I tend to drive people hopping mad. Anyway. We're all doomed. Whitefield was a transatlantic preacher. He made 13 preaching trips to North America. There he built on the work of preachers like Jonathan Edwards, 1703 to 58. A boy genius who entered Yale College aged just 12, Edwards decided to become a minister when he experienced a divine and supernatural light. Edwards believed that God's love shone like a divine light over the universe. Believers, anybody at any time, could sense this light through the Holy Spirit and apprehend the things of God. He couldn't stand the passive, superficial religious observance he saw around him and insisted on real commitment. His sermons are passionate, outspoken, built on the concept of justification by faith, and full of the language of hell, fire, and damnation. It was time for sinners to get real and get saved. It was Edwards' sermons that really started the Great Awakening in British America. Later on, he fell out with the members of his church over a theological argument. He was forced out of the church and became pastor of a frontier mission church in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and a missionary to the local Indian tribe, the Housatonic Indians, as opposed to the Isotonic Indians who are fond of Lucozade. He became president of the College of New Jersey, now somewhat better known as Princetown. When a smallpox epidemic hit the town, he decided to get inoculated to show people it was safe and effective. He caught smallpox from the inoculation and died on the 22nd of March, 1758. Oops. The Great Unwashed. Back in Britain, Wesley followed Whitefield into the fields and other outdoor spaces, and all heaven was breaking loose. Tears were commonplace, not to mention convulsions, collapses, shaking, fits, uncontrollable laughter, miraculous healings, exorcisms, and divine visions. The state church was prepared to admit that Jesus and the disciples did such things, but that was back in pagan times, when people didn't know any better. Surely Britain, Christian Britain, didn't need such signs and wonders. It was all very vulgar. As were the people to whom Whitefield and Wesley preached. Vulgar people. Common. People who lived in poverty and neglect. People who had never before been told that God actually cared about them. They were thirsty for faith. The size of the crowds was astonishing. On one night, 3,000 people gathered to hear Wesley preach in a field. The crowd was down a bit, but to be fair, it was a Monday night. He got more later in the week. In Blackheath, he preached to nearly 14,000 people. He rode 3,000 miles a year on his preaching journeys, and often preached more than 1,000 times a year. He devised a method of voice projection that was close to singing, which allowed his voice to be heard outdoors. Wesley, though, had something a lot of the other preacher evangelists didn't have, the ability to organise. He understood that you needed to nurture new converts and support them. So he organised a system of weekly study groups who would listen to teaching, pray, sing, and be accountable to one another. He wasn't trying to set up a new denomination. He was trying to breathe new life into the Anglicans. But, inevitably, there was to be a parting of the ways. He used lay leaders. This was a matter of practicality as much as anything else. He originally wanted ordained clergy to lead the groups, but hardly any of them wanted anything to do with Wesley. And he even allowed, wait for it, women to lead. It is hard nowadays, where Methodism has become so respectable, to get our heads around the outrage and the disdain of those days. The revivalists were beaten up by mobs. They were showered with stones, rotting fruit, firebombs even. They were rounded up by clergy and local officials. But the ordinary people loved it. Around 30,000 people signed up to Wesley's groups. He had a network of more than 100 preachers. Wesley pushed himself continually to the limits, and by now he had more or less given up on the Anglican Church. He started ordaining his own leaders, much to the shock of his brother, who became a famous hymn writer, and he rewrote the Book of Common Prayer. He also came into conflict with other revival leaders over the issue of predestination. Whitefield accepted it, but Wesley said that it represents the most holy God as worse than the devil. Despite the fact that his books brought him an annual income of up to £1,400, he insisted on living on 30, the average wage of an ordinary worker. He gave the rest away. No wonder the fat cats in the Anglican Church hated him so much. Not all Anglicans hated him. Evangelicalism hit the Anglican Church as well. Leaders like John Newton, the former slave trader and hymn writer, preached the evangelical need to be born again. In the industrial towns of Britain, these dissenters saw huge growth. 20 years after John Wesley's death, 5% of Britain's population belonged to his Methodist societies. The name was a mocking nickname, originally applied to all evangelicals, but coming to be used of only Wesley's followers. They were by far the largest of the dissenting denominations, and their following was especially strong in the industrial towns of the north. And there were other mini-Wesleys at work. In 1800, a man called Hugh Bourne preached to thousands of workers in Harrishead, Cheshire, a neighbourhood he described as the most ungodly and profane in England. He earned a reputation as a zealous preacher, albeit very shy. He was so embarrassed by the whole thing that he spent the whole sermon with his hands over his eyes. He rejected the by now traditional Methodist service as being boring and out of date, and developed a camp-style service, as opposed to a camp service, with open-air preaching, public confession of sin, group prayer, and hymn singing. And by 1804, revival had spread to the neighbouring towns. The Methodist leadership, far from welcoming this, felt his methods to be inappropriate. In 1807, the Methodist Conference said that it is our judgment that even supposing such meetings to be allowable in America, they are highly improper in England and likely to be productive of considerable mischief, and we disclaim all connection with them. They expelled him, and refused even to let those converted by Bourne enter their churches. So Bourne created the primitive Methodists, and the whirring sounds of the industrial north were augmented by the sound of Wesley spinning in his grave. Sunday schools. Bourne's movement recognised that there was more to evangelicalism than just a spiritual experience. Like many other dissenting movements, he spoke out against the drunkenness and alcoholism that served to make the conditions of working people slightly more bearable. He encouraged lay preachers. Indeed, many early trade union leaders learned their skills as primitive Methodist preachers. And he promoted education for the working class. In this, he was following in the footsteps of Robert Raikes, 1736 to 1811. Raikes was a publisher, the proprietor of the Gloucester Journal, and a committed Christian who came to see that many people were trapped because they had no access to education. Raikes started a school for boys in the slums, and since most of those boys worked during the week, he ran it on a Sunday. It was the world's first Sunday school. The first school opened in 1780 in the home of a Mrs. Meredith. Raikes paid for the schooling himself and used his newspaper to publicise and promote his work. Within 2 years, several schools for girls and boys had opened around Gloucester. Some were outraged. The schools were mocked as Raikes' ragged school. But by 1831, Sunday schools in Great Britain had a weekly attendance of 1,250,000 children, an astonishing 25% of the child population. They are the forerunners of the state school system, a system that was not put in place until the Elementary Education Act of 1870. I never knew it would happen with the MP from Clapham. In 1785, an MP called William Wilberforce, 1759 to 1833, got saved. 2 years later, he came into contact with a group of anti-slavery activists who persuaded Wilberforce to take up the cause. Europe had built its colonial power through the use of slaves. Over 100,000 slaves were trafficked across the Atlantic each year to work in the plantations in America and the West Indies. Conditions on the slave ships were horrific, and a high percentage of the captives never survived the journey. In some ways, though, the abolitionists were drawing on a radically different reading of the Bible. Read the Bible literally and uncritically, and it is hard to find a condemnation of slavery. The only overt statement against the trade in human misery comes from that subversive commie tract, Revelation, which talks of Babylon's evil trade in slaves and human souls. Revelation 18:13. On the contrary, both the Hebrew Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and the Christian New Testament take the condition of slavery for granted. Wilberforce and his circle, known as the Clapham sect, after the South London village where they lived, were therefore arguing for a different way of reading the Bible. This was reading from the standpoint of natural justice. It was just plain wrong for people to be slaves. So, we must re-examine the Bible to find evidence to substantiate our arguments. Wilberforce devoted the rest of his life to the abolition of slavery. Trading in slaves was finally abolished throughout the empire in 1807, but it was still legal to own them, and those born to slaves were still slaves. It was not until 1833 that slavery was finally abolished throughout the British Empire. Wilberforce never got to see it. He died a month before the vote was passed. But by then he knew that it was going to happen, and he died knowing that his life's work would come to fruition. Encyclopedic knowledge. On All Saints' Day in 1755, an earthquake hit Lisbon, Portugal. It was Sunday, so the churches were packed. The earthquake shattered buildings. A tsunami hit the harbour. Fires broke out throughout the city. Some 30,000 people lost their lives. It was an event that shattered many Europeans' image of God as a benevolent creator. The writer and thinker Voltaire wrote a poem on the Lisbon disaster, in which he railed against the idea that the world was under the detailed control of God. In France, Denis Diderot published the Encyclopedic, which included many dangerous new ideas. It openly attacked Christianity. It was banned and copies were burned, but it was widely read all the same. Others attacked the credibility of the scriptures. At Hamburg University, a deist scholar called Hermann Reimarus, 1694 to 1768, wrote a critique of the Bible. He kept it unpublished until after he was dead and safely out of the way. Perhaps he hid it under Arminius' hat. He was interested in establishing its history. How did this document come to be written? What were the sources? What picture did it really show? He decided that the Gospels really depicted Jesus as a preacher and a political activist whose career ended in failure and whose followers created the myth that he had returned from the dead, largely to avoid having to go back to fishing for a living. Reimarus' ideas were influential and were really the beginnings of modern revisionist historians of the historical Jesus school. This type of approach, sceptical, questioning, focusing on reason, has become known as the Enlightenment. It was not a movement without faith. Many of its proponents were deists, but more, they also had a deep faith in human progress, a faith that, in the long run, was to prove rather unreasonable in itself.